Hi everyone. So this week you are going to be working on your Milestone 2 assignment. And so again, I wanted to review the requirements of the assignment and what I'm expecting in it. So in your Milestone 2 assignment, you are going to be identifying the issue that you're going to discuss in your final project. And this is a really important milestone because a good part of the final project is going to really center on your issue that you pick. And so picking a solid issue and having a good understanding of it can either really support your final project or derail your final project. So that's why I wanted to spend some time really going through this in detail with you. And so this will be a little bit of a longer video, but again, as I said, this is a really important part of your final project, and getting this right early on can save you a lot of time down the road. So to start with, when we talk about what is an issue, I want to differentiate between a topic and an issue. So a topic refers to the broad subject areas that we're addressing in this course. Things like gender and race, ethnicity, ableism, age, economic status. So if you look at the syllabus, any of the big topics that are listed there, those are what we're talking about as topics. For your final project, you are going to be picking an issue. An issue refers to a problem within one of those topics. So your issue must relate to one of the topics, so one of the broad subject areas that we talk about in this course. And I know there are lots of other forms of diversity that we won't get to in this course, but because this final project is designed to demonstrate your understanding and learning from the course, it does need to relate to the course content. And so an issue is a problem. It's something that relates to one of those topics that you see as causing problems for a particular population within that kind of area, whether it's a particular race or ethnicity, a gender, form of sexuality. One thing I want to make very clear, because it's been a problem in the past, is that social movements are not issues. Social movements are ways of addressing issues. And so, let me give you a couple of examples to explain what I mean. So, for example, Me Too. That is a social movement. The issue that it is addressing is sexual harassment. So the movement itself is not the problem. Well, it may be a problem for the people who are, being identified as sexual harassers and losing their jobs and, being outed by the movement. But, the movement itself is not what we consider the issue. The issue is what they are trying to address, which is sexual harassment. Another example that has been popular in past courses is Black Lives Matter. And again, Black Lives Matter is not an issue. It's not a problem. It is a social movement that is trying to address the issue of police violence against minorities, and particularly against Black people and young Black men. So either of those issues you could talk about, and you can certainly, bring in the social movement in your discussion of the issue. You can be inspired by a movement to tackle a particular social issue, but the movement itself is not the issue. You can also, take inspiration from social movements when you're coming up with your strategic plan. Now, of course, if you take inspiration from any other movements or from any place else, then you will be, of course, I trust, giving proper credit and citing sources on that. But, if you wanted to talk about sexual harassment, certainly you could refer to the Me Too movement and discuss some of the tactics that they're using that you might use in your own strategic plan. So hopefully this has clarified a little bit what a topic is, what an issue is, and what it isn't. So again, you're looking for a problem that you can solve. And this is where I really, strongly encourage you to start with the end in mind. That is, understand what it is that your final project is ultimately asking you to do, which is to create a strategic plan to address the issue, to try to ameliorate the problem, to try to help, lessen and, what the consequences are for the target population that you're going to be discussing. So, and, given all that you will be discussing in your final project, the strategic plan is certainly the centerpiece of it, but it is, just one piece of it. There'll be other pieces, including your introduction and some other discussions of ideas and concepts from the course. So realistically, out of a 10 to 12 minute presentation, you'll have about 5 to 6 minutes to identify your issue and go over your strategic plan. And this is my first fair warning to you, and I will repeat this warning, but consider this your fair warning right here, that for your final project, it is to be an 8 to 12 minute presentation, and I stop listening at the 12-minute mark. So anything that is included in your presentation after the 12-minute mark will not be considered for part of your grade. You will, receive a 0 for that. So make sure that your presentations are tight. And so keeping that in mind, you'll want to keep your issue fairly narrow. You want to be able to really hone in on a particular issue and on something that you can come up with a strong strategic plan around and communicate that strategic plan in 5 to 6 minutes. So like I said, you want to keep it fairly narrow. I'll use an example, as if I were doing the project from my own point of view as a librarian. So I might say that, a problem I see at the library is that we don't have enough minorities from our community coming into the library to use it, that we're not reaching diverse populations within the city of Baltimore. Okay, that's a huge topic. I can't possibly talk about that in 5 to 6 minutes. I can't come up with a reasonable strategic plan for that. I can't delve into it with any depth or specificity, that's a difficult word. And so, that's going to be much too hard. I need to narrow that down. But I also don't want to go so narrow that I can't find research on my topic. So, let's say I decided that, a population that I noticed that really isn't coming into the library and needs our services are transgender immigrants from Korea. Okay, that's much too narrow. I'm not going to find, or I probably will not find any existing literature that specifically talks about how to serve transgender immigrants from Korea in the library. That's more of a dissertation topic where you're doing your own original research. So, you want to pick something that's fairly narrow, but not too narrow and too specific that you can't find any research on it. And I do, you are required as part of your milestone to refer to scholarly research. And, I highly recommend that you do some searches to make sure that there is literature existing on whatever subject you want to do if it is a fairly narrow or specific topic. A better topic might be something like, elderly African Americans in the community. are they being served, or are we able to serve transgender teenagers? So in narrowing your topic, and so again, your issue must relate to at least one of the topics that we talk about. But in coming up with your issue, you probably will hit on more than one topic because you'll need to narrow it down. And this is, kind of harkens back to the matrix of domination and what we call intersectional identities. That is, identities that are, well, we all have intersectional identities. We all have identities that are made up of multiple components. But in this context, we're talking about minority populations that are made up of multiple minority identities. So again, something like transgender immigrants, or elderly African Americans, disabled Latinx population, or disabled women. You could come up with any number of combinations, but that's going to be a good way for you to narrow your topic. Another way to narrow your topic and to keep it specific is, as I also recommended earlier in this, is to think globally, act locally. So you may be interested in gender issues and in sexual harassment. Well, so if you look at your local context, either your work site, your specific work site, your field, your professional field, your field of study, your local community, that may help you to narrow things down again, so that instead of looking at sexual harassment for women, which is again, very broad topic, something that you can't really reasonably talk about in a 5 to 6 minute presentation, you could talk about sexual harassment within nursing. And you might even narrow it down further. If you find that there's a particular population that's more susceptible, you might talk about sexual harassment among nursing students, or sexual harassment among minority nurses. So try to get as narrow as possible without again, limiting yourself too much in what you can find in the literature. And earlier this week I did post a guide to scholarly literature and to finding scholarly sources. And so, make sure you're checking there to, see that you can actually find existing literature to refer to on any of these topics. So that's my, narrow, but not too narrow. And, again, think about your, the final product, your strategic plan. What is a topic that you can create a reasonable strategic plan to address? I don't expect you to solve racism. I don't expect you to solve homophobia. I expect you to create a strategic plan that addresses a specific form of homophobia, or specific form of racism in a specific context. And with your strategic plans, we haven't gotten to that part yet, but when we do get there, I'll reiterate this, that I would much rather see a plan that is modest but well thought out, concrete, and specific than a plan that is very broad and ambitious and improbable. I would much rather see that you have really thought through the steps of the strategic plan, how you would implement it, who the stakeholders are, what the consequences would be, how you would implement the whole thing. And again, we'll get into more detail about that when we get to the strategic plan part of the final project. But that's something to keep in mind when you're picking your issue, is it something that you could reasonably come up with a plan to address? So, looking at, as always, I recommend that you look both at the assignment and at the rubric and make sure that you address all parts of the assignment. For this particular milestone, you'll be, again, identifying the issue. You'll need to talk about the origin of the issue, give a little bit of background on it. When did this emerge? How did it emerge? Has this been an ongoing problem for many years, or is this a new issue? If it's having to do with a new immigrant population that's recently come into your community, you might want to give some history about them, the influx into the community and the changing demographics. If it has to do with sexual harassment of nursing students, I'll go back to that. Again, you might want to talk about a little bit about the origin of how this issue has come to the forefront, who is already addressing this, and give, that background on it. You're going to need to identify the target population. Again, be specific. I'm going to keep using that word, specific, specific, specific. If you're talking about sexual harassment, it's not enough to say that it affects all women. Or if you're talking about racial discrimination, it's not enough to say that it, affects all people of color. Because again, your issue needs to be specific, and so your target population needs to be specific. So it needs to be, that it is affecting nurses, particularly nurses of color, or that it is, particularly affecting transgender teenagers in your community, something like that. I want you to be very specific about who the target population is that you're addressing with your issue. And I want data. I expect, particularly when you get to the final project stage, but, again, you'll set yourself up for more success if you do it at this stage in your milestone. How many people are affected? If you're telling me that this is an issue that affects nursing students, okay, how many nursing students are there? Or how many female nursing students are there? How many instances of harassment are there estimated to have been reported? If you're talking about, again, going back to my library example, if I was, talking about elderly African Americans in Baltimore, okay, well, how many elderly African Americans are there in Baltimore? What are their ages? Do I have any data on their library use to support the position that they're not using the library and that this is a population that we need to reach? Give me the data, describe your target population as specifically and as in much detail as you can, because that shows me that you really understand the issue and you understand who's being affected by this issue. You need to be able to relate your issue to at least one of the topics. And again, it's not enough to simply say, oh, well, I'm talking about sexual harassment and that has to do with gender. I'm expecting when you're relating it to the topic that you are drawing on course resources to say, that it relates to this reading that we did, or that it relates to this theory that somebody talked about. Bring in the matrix of domination and talking about, if you're doing something on sexual harassment of minority nurses, nurses of color. Okay, so, talk about the matrix of domination and how those topics intersect and, how they build on each other. If you're talking about, what's another topic I was thinking about earlier? Harassment of female graduate students in STEM fields. Again, be prepared to be bringing in the readings on gender and sexual harassment, and really relating it to the topics that we're talking about in the course in a meaningful way. Because again, a big part of this final project is demonstrating that you understand the course material and can apply it to a real world situation. So I need to know that you've done the readings. I need to see that you can connect those readings to your particular issue. And finally, impact on the population, the impact of the issue on the population. Specific, 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 data, data, data. If you're talking about, sexual harassment of a particular group, again, how many instances are there estimated to be? What are the consequences of that for, people who experience harassment, whether it's, psychological, whether it has to do with career development and career chances, attrition in a particular field, again, going back to my example of graduate students in STEM fields, we know that sexual harassment contributes to a high attrition rate among female graduate students in those fields. So, that would be a consequence, that is showing the impact on the population. So, again, be specific, draw on research, draw on your scholarly sources. I know some of this may seem common sense things that you think, oh, well, of course I understand the consequences of sexual harassment, or I understand the consequences of racial discrimination. But again, I want to see that you've done the research and that you've really dug into this. So make sure you're citing scholarly sources to back up all of your statements. At this point, I don't think any of you have a PhD in any of these subjects. If you do, then, yes, you can cite yourself, but otherwise, you are not yet experts in this field, and so you should be really citing credible scholarly sources to back up your statements about the impact on the populations, about who the target population is, about the origin of the problem, unless it's, again, something that's very specific that you have an insider knowledge of. And in that case, we'll talk about that on a case-by-case basis. So, that's a lot of material to cover, and, in a 2 to 3 page paper. But again, the more specific, the more data driven you are at this earlier stage, the more thought you give to your issue at this early stage, you're going to set yourself up for success down the line, because so much of the rest of the final project will derive itself from the issue that you pick. If you have a question about whether an issue that you're interested in is specific enough or too specific or appropriate, feel free to shoot me an email at e.bintrum@snhu.edu. And, again, if you can send those to me as early as you can in the week, so that way I have a chance to take a look at it and give it some thought and get back to you before the assignment is due. I think that is everything I need to say on Milestone 1, but of course, always feel free to ask me, Milestone 2. And again, feel free to ask me questions as you come up with them. Thank you.